with the rich man? Fire. Okay? So what is being talked about is not a new concept in the New Testament. It's already written about in the Old Testament. Okay? We also looked at Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 15, and it says towards the latter part on it, it says, "Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit." What is used there is, in the Hebrew wording, it's Sheol. And when it refers to the sides of the pit, it means that you're segregated. The wicked is segregated somehow. Now, remember Luke chapter 16. The segregation is this big gulf in between that's impassable of those two souls. So it's the same thought here. And if you have, depending on your translation may say deep recesses. It may say lowest depths. It may say furthest reaches. Just whoever the translators of your particular translation wants to use to try to say you're as far away and you're segregated away from everyone else. Okay? So that's what the thoughts are in the Old Testament. And then what I want you to do is, and we didn't get to this last week, we touched on it a little bit, is if you would turn over to Psalms 88. David uses the word Sheol, it's 14 or 15 times. I cannot remember the exact number, but it's right around 15 times. And Psalms chapter 88 is one place where David uses it for this idea of where the soul goes. Now, I have the New King James Version. I'm going to read just verse 3, and then I'm going to ask to see if anybody has a different, wording than what I'm going to read. Okay, in verse 3 it says, "For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to the grave." Now, in reading the King James Version, it looks like all David is saying is, I'm aged, and eventually they're going to put me into a grave. But does anybody have a different translation? Sheol is used there. It's talking about David is saying that his soul is full of troubles, and yes, he is aged, but his soul is going to go to Sheol. Now, if you remember Acts chapter 2, the implication in Acts chapter 2 is that Christ has come out of Sheol, but David is still there. It specifically says David has not gone to heaven in Acts chapter 2. It says David's not in heaven. It doesn't mean David went to hell as in punishment. It just means that David is still in some type of intermediate state from his soul perspective. It also said that David's body was still in the tomb. So his body in a dust form or whatever form it's in is still wherever he was originally put following his death. So the thought here is he's talking about his soul going to Sheol following his death. But here's the other part of this that I want us to look at. Because as I read through this, you're going to notice that the word Sheol is not used again in your translation. Instead, what is used are those other words that I talked about for pit and for grave. So let's read verses 4 through 12, then we're going to talk about it just a little bit. In verse 4 it says, "I am counted with those who go down to the pit. I am like a man who has no strength, adrift among the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, and who are cut off from your hand. You have laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness in the depths. Your wrath lies upon me heavily, and you have afflicted me with all your waves. Selah. You have put away my acquaintances far from me. You have made me an abomination to them. I am shut up, and I cannot get out. My eyes waste away because of affliction. Lord, I have called daily upon you. I have stretched out my hands to you. And now look at the last part of this, because here's the emphasis, is verses 10 through 12, a series of questions. Will you work wonders for the dead? Shall the dead arise and praise you? Selah. Shall your loving kindness be declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in the place of destruction? Shall your wonders be known in the dark, and your forgiveness in the land of forgetfulness? There are many thoughts here that we've read through, but the one thing I want us to glean out of this is the idea of, in verse 10, where will you work wonders for the dead? Verse 11, shall your love kindness be declared in the grave? The general thought among scholars is that David is basically saying, when my soul is in Sheol, my body goes to the ground. When my body's in the ground, can my body do anything? No. The body is literally dead. It is soulless. Okay? Is the point he's trying to get across here. You can't wait till you die to then say, oh, well, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. That's part of his whole point here. Now he also talks of, resurrection, a bodily resurrection, is what some scholars believe he's talking about in here. But the point that David's trying to make is what happens after death. Okay? And his fear is he's approaching it. And he starts differentiating between soul and body. And wherever you see the word grave in here, it literally means where the body is placed. When you see the word pit, it's literally the concept of this big hole in the ground, whether it be man-made or just existing. Something physical in earth. So, any thoughts on this? Because the whole point is you can't go into the grave and praise God from there. It does no purpose. You can't do it, for one thing. It doesn't exist anymore. Okay. Any thoughts? Yeah, Margaret. The body feels pain. Yes. We don't know. We don't know. The thing about the intermediate state, there's enough there to tease us. But there's also enough there to instruct us. When you piece it all together, there's enough there that should be able to tell us, here is if you're at a plane, 30,000 foot level, here's basically what it's going to be. But only God knows all the details, and we don't know how that interaction works. Anybody have any thoughts? Because it's a very good question. Yeah.
So, back to the story of Lazarus and the rich man.
Yes.
You mentioned that body goes into the ground, soul goes to the Sheol. So you look at the story. I'm reading it and I'm looking at him asking for water, a soul asking for water, and then he's also seeing. So he's seeing a soul seeing something in a physical body.
And he puts it all in physical text to be understood. And you got to remember, it's a parable. What did Christ do with parables? You got to put them in something that people can relate to give the concept. We don't know the details of how the soul may actually, how it's going to, it's saying, well, here, let me, I just need the fingertip with water. that's the concept of just trying to get more of, in my mind, the concept of there is going to be no relief. Okay? There's either going to be the reward or there's going to be, the punishment side. And it's put in terms that people could understand, relate to. But as far as the actual details, I do not take it necessarily literally because it is a parable. I take the lesson out of it. And God knows the details of how that's actually going to work. And it drives us up the wall, doesn't it? Yes, and to me, that's why when we get into looking at Revelation here in a little bit, why it's important to understand what the King James Version is really talking about, because it specifically says in there, in the King James Version, that come the judgment, that Christ is going to destroy hell. It means he's destroying the unseen place where the soul goes, okay? But there's this separate place, this separate hell, in terms of the King James Version, that is Gehenna, which is the eternal punishment after judgment. And so there's a big difference. And that's why you'll read a lot of writings that will say, well, there is no eternal punishment. The Bible says so. So no, the King James Version implies it. But if you look at the actual Greek language, it's two clear differentiation paths. And any other questions? Because there's a lot of confusion here, mainly because of how the King James Version was written and how we read it today with these preconceived ideas of a particular word that really didn't mean that way back in the early 1600s or even the 1700s.
I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's punishment or reward in the unseen place that immediately after that. So that implies that there's punishment or reward prior to judgment.
Yes, there is. The way the Bible's written is basically when your life ends, you're either going to a reward or a punishment, and then what the judgment does that follows the resurrection, the resurrection combines the soul back with the body, and then there's the resurrection for the book of life, where then, here's the final decision. And some people believe because you do have that intermediate state, you can pray people out from this one to where when the judgment comes, they can actually go from down here to judgment and then to heaven. Or just go ahead and say you go from here and then you can go to heaven, or you can just go directly to heaven. And we don't really know what that unseen place is. They may actually be the same thing. It's just a confirmation at the end. I don't know. The Bible splits it up, though.
Well, most people will have confidence that they're going to heaven, which is after the judgment, but that also would imply that they could be in torment prior to going to heaven.
That's what some places would believe, yes. And the Bible splits it up conceptually for us to understand that prior to the resurrection, there is still a place where there is a reward and punishment. And what is used there is the concept of Hades, because that's what, again, I relate it to more of a parable sense of just trying to understand, not necessarily that God has you're going to walk in and it's going to go, oh, Tartarus, okay? You go through that door that's labeled Tartarus. It's more, in my mind, it's the concept so you can understand, something you could relate to. But yes, there's a lot of iterations that people will try to read and connect dots to show where you could go or opportunities to go, how family members on earth could be involved in praying for you or giving money to the church or whatever to get you to move into these different levels. Yes, ma'am. The Bible differentiates with Gehenna to be more of a pit of fire. And visually, we think of it as being a far significant worse punishment because there's not a lot of information that is written other than what we read in Luke chapter 16 and what we read earlier in, Deuteronomy chapter 32, that talks about there is a fiery pit even for the soul itself. Now, the one thing I really like, and I'm glad you brought it up, the concept of the resurrection is you now get to be closer to God at the resurrection. That concept in the Hadean world is not, that level of detail is not provided for Sheol, for Hades in the Bible. It actually does appear that with the resurrection, there is this higher level of being closer to God then. Because again, when we look at, and we may not get to it today, but when we look at Revelation, we see where death is destroyed and Hades is destroyed. In other words, there is no further bodies that exist, period. Because they don't experience, death is no longer experienced anymore. That physical death. When you see the word death in relationship, and death is coupled with Hades several times in the Old Testament, it's talking about the death is the physical body, Hades is the spiritual part of it. And we'll talk about that in more detail. Yeah, go ahead, Ron. Oh, no, let's go ahead. See if you can confuse them. Oh, yeah, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I'm trying to think how to put this. Y'all quit laughing over there. The reason I'm being cautious about that is I'm trying to also relate that to Revelation chapter 6, where it talks about, basically what appears to be the end of time. Okay? And so, and I do not know, and to me the Bible does not say what happens, what are the details that is described in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. It just says the dead, remember, that was all written to say those who are dead in Christ will rise first, because that's what the concern was. That's what he wrote to address. And then he says, and then those who are alive will rise. Now, we don't know the timing of God. I don't know if he goes one person at a time or if he goes billions at a time, I would think he could go billions at a time of those who are alive. And basically there is no Hades to go to anymore. That they have suffered the physical death. There is no more physical death. He's going to destroy Hades. And those who happen to be alive, they just go straight to the judgment, and that's it. Yeah, go ahead. Unless you... And if anybody has any other input, please feel free to speak up.
What I would say about what you were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
There's absolutely no comfort in Luke 16 for someone that believes in purgatory.
Very good point. No comfort in Luke 16 for anyone who believes in purgatory.
It's because of the phrase, great gulf fixed. Great gulf fixed. That not even Abraham could traverse, I guess would be the right way to say that. But I think the more important lesson for us in Luke 16 is that death does not, there's a lot of things that death doesn't destroy. And one of the things that I think about is that death doesn't destroy memory, because the rich man, remembered that he had a family.
Yes.
I mean, like, hey, go warn my brothers about this place. And so it's also not a comfort to someone that would be contemplating suicide as a way to get out of their problems, because that's I've got all these problems, I just want to escape. It's not a comfort for that person either, because if I'm not in Christ, I've got the potential to continue to experience pain and consider problems that are going on in this life and the afterlife. And so, I just think about it that way. But for us, Luke 16 should, I think, be a very important passage, because it gives you a really neat window into what the hereafter is going to be like. Unless what you were alluding to earlier, unless Christ comes back first, and we
Right.
don't get to experience that particular realm.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Well, I've been in the other class, and so you may have
Oh, I thought you were fixing to say I've been to Hades, and I'm just in the other class.
So you may have already addressed these ideas, but I wonder whether this is a possible good reading of Scripture. That under the patriarchal and Mosaic dispensations, Mosaical being a schoolmaster to bring us to a greater revelation in Christ, that there was only this limited understanding that there's some sort of afterlife or some sort of underworld, but little was taught about, little was revealed about it. And then in Christ we have a greater revelation of what that is. And so in the New Testament, some of that language was brought forward to help people understand a greater revelation of the underworld, so that it's not 3 or 4 different things, but there's only reward and punishment. And that, and this, I may be missing a lot here, but
No, you're doing great. Continue, please.
this idea of precedence or of time passing in the afterlife may be something we completely are misunderstanding, because we're talking about being in eternity. And so a person might die and immediately face the judgment at the same time that everyone else, at the same perceived time that everyone else faces the judgment. And yet there's a judgment day. When I die, that will be judgment day. Or when Christ returns and I'm still alive, that will be judgment day. And yet we all face the day, the dies irae, the judgment day, the day of reckoning, day of wrath. What do you make of that?
What I make of it is that what the Bible provides us is something that we can take our minds and cognitively relate to it. However, with God, there's probably the concept of time we have an idea for it because we've defined it. God can make time and space whatever he wants it to be. And that level of detail is not given anywhere in the Old Testament or New Testament. It's just the idea of that what is there for our learning is that, and you got to remember how things were in the Old Testament and how they were at the time of Christ. At the time of Christ, the world with the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, believed in a Hadean world. It believed this Hadean world had multiple places. The lowest place where there was punishment for the wicked was referred to as Tartarus. And the word Tartarus is never used in the New Testament, but the verb tartaru is used, or tartatu is used to basically mean to be put in Tartarus. So it talks about being placed into the place where evil people go for punishment. That is specifically in the New Testament. We talked about that, a couple of months ago. The other idea is that there is a separation between the two. They don't intermix. And then there is a place of reward. And actually, in the Greek mythology, there's multiple places of reward within Hades. There's a place that the Romans referred to as Elysian Fields. And if you ever watch the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe, right before they go into battle, he says, and if you wake up in Elysian Fields, the battle's over for you, or something like that. Because you have gone to this special place where the leaders go and those who fight battles for their country go. Now, the common folk, their souls don't associate with you, but they go to this other area. That's the non-Elysian Fields, but it has a different name. Basically, it's, common people enter here if you've been good. But it was still this concept of separation from the evil, punishment for the evil, reward for the good. And the New Testament takes that concept and uses it to try and relates it back. But again, and it's to make a point here that you can't change anything once the decision's made. Once you've lived your life, your soul belongs to God. It's like I mentioned at the beginning of this, your soul is like a stick drive, a thumb drive. And when your life is over, God says, give me that. I know how you lived your life now. And now I'll wait for Judgment Day. Or actually, he already knows something happens. And then when it gets recombined with the body, then do you get closer to God, like you mentioned. And any other thoughts? Because we need to wrap this up. We may already be running a little late. Yeah. That's the whole point. Yes. That's right. Well, we'll pick up from here next week and hit a couple of high points remaining in Psalms, look at the book of Revelation, and then probably just hit a couple of high points with Luke 16, because we've already talked about Luke 16 for several weeks. We just haven't read it yet. But y'all have a great day, and I appreciate your attention and all the comments and all the questions.
Morning and welcome to our worship service at Hoover today. Hope you're doing well. It's good to see everybody. We have some visitors here today. We welcome you and hope you'll come back and be with us again. We do want everybody to fill out a card. I mentioned last week we haven't been having 100% participation in that, and we'd like to get closer to everybody filling one out. If you would, members and visitors alike, there's an appropriate card for you to fill out. Just do that now if you would and pass it to either end of the aisle, and we'll come by and pick that up in a few minutes. I have a couple of short announcements I want to make before I get into preparing us for our worship theme for today. One is, I don't know if you've heard of a group called Healing Hands International. Some of you